I was born September the 29th, 1758, in the parsonage house in Burnham Thorpe. Was sent to the high school at Norwich and afterwards removed to North Walsham, from whence, on the disturbance with Spain relative to the Falkland Islands, I went to sea with my uncle, Captain Maurice Suckling, in the Raisonnable of 64 guns. Horatio Nelson's own words in his first attempt at a biography, but he omitted the fact that he was 12 years old when he first went to sea with his uncle. He was the sixth of 11 children, 3 of whom died in infancy. His mother and her mother died within a week of each other when he was 9 years old, leaving his father, the rector of Burnham Thorpe, the burden of raising his 8 remaining children alone. Maurice Suckling, brother of his mother, was informed that the child Horatio wished to join the Navy and is reputed to have said, "What has poor Horatio done, who is so weak, that he, above all the rest, should be sent to rough it out at sea? But let him come, and the first time we go into action, a cannonball may knock off his head and provide for him at once." We don't know, but it was perhaps portentous that the year before Nelson was born, during the 7 Years' War, his uncle captained one of 3 ships in the West Indies which attacked the French, who had more than twice their number, and came off best. Captain Suckling always celebrated that date, the 21st of October, throughout Nelson's life. Nelson proved to be an ardent and successful student at sea, and combined with that, a healthy disregard for orders. The first time he's recorded to have disobeyed was when he had persuaded the captain of HMS Carcass to allow him to serve as coxswain on an expedition to the Arctic. And during a fog, when the ships were bound in the ice, he stole away in pursuit of a polar bear. The 15-year-old Nelson wanted to take the pelt back to his father, the rector, but was finally dissuaded when his captain fired a warning shot from the ship. As he developed, Nelson showed that he had a natural way with those around him. As a young captain of the Boreas, a frigate of 24 guns, he gave particular attention to his midshipmen, whom he called his children. On that ship, there were 30 of them, and he's recorded as having challenged a timid young officer, saying, "Well, sir, I'm going a race to the masthead and beg I may meet you there." Nelson beat him to the top, and when the midshipman arrived, Nelson engaged him in a cheerful manner, saying how much a person was to be pitied who could fancy there was any danger or even anything disagreeable in the attempt. Later, the young midshipman led some of his peers up the rigging, having overcome his earlier fear. Nelson was loved by all those who served under him, and much of that sentiment can be attributed to his attitude and behavior to those for whom he was responsible. He demanded extremely high standards, but was kind, concerned, and paid them attention which they rarely experienced with many other superior officers. He proved to be something of a continual seeker of danger, and wrote to his wife Fanny, "Life is disgrace, if dreadful. A glorious death is to be envied, and if anything happens to me, recollect that death is a debt we all must pay, and whether now or a few years hence can be of little consequence." It was during the siege of Calvi in 1794 that Nelson was knocked down by a narrow miss of a cannonball. In his first report, he wrote to Lord Hood, "I got a little hurt this morning, not much, as you may judge from my writing." And the following day he wrote again, "My eye is better, and I hope not entirely to lose the sight." In the letter to his uncle, he said, "You will be surprised when I say I was wounded in the head by stones from the merlon of our battery. My right eye is cut entirely down, but the surgeons flatter me I shall not entirely lose the sight of that eye. At present I can distinguish light from dark, but no object. It confined me one day when, thank God, I was enabled to attend to my duty. I feel the want of it, but such is the chance of war, it was within a hair's breadth of taking off my head." It turns out that the retina had probably become detached, and his sight in that eye gradually deteriorated from then on. 6 months later, he told his wife, "My eye has grown worse and is in almost total darkness and very painful at times. But never mind, I can see very well with the other." These were tough times, and they bred tough people. At the Battle of Cape St. Vincent in 1797, well, Nelson once more disobeyed orders. He left the line, something that was regarded as an appalling professional lapse and normally associated unforgivingly with cowardice. But he had seen an opportunity to strike a decisive blow against the Spanish and took it, and arguably his actions led to a significant victory. Some have argued that of the many acts of courage in his career, this was perhaps the most sublime, extraordinary, and rewarding. Suffice to say that having lost all his sail and his mast to the enemy fire of 5 ships, Nelson directed his ship alongside a Spanish vessel and boarded her, and thence to another, both of which surrendered. It was after this battle that Nelson's ambitions became crystal clear: the attainment of public honors and the ambition to be distinguished above his fellows. Nelson was prepared to take any and all risks in the service of his country, and in return he craved the greatest rewards in terms of acknowledgement. Later the same year, Nelson was shot in the right arm whilst leading an abortive attack on Tenerife in the Canary Islands. The English had lost the element of surprise, the currents and wind were strong, and the Spanish were waiting in force. It was a serious wound, and he was rowed back to his ship. In typical fashion, he refused help to get on board. "Let me alone. I have yet my legs left and one arm. Tell the surgeon to make haste and get his instruments. I know I must lose my right arm, so the sooner it's off, the better." As he managed to get on board, he was greeted with a formality befitting an admiral, and he returned all the salutes as best he could with a useless and bleeding arm. From where we stand today, how strange their world was. The one captain who managed to get ashore that night found himself and his 340 men in the morning surrounded. He sent word with a flag of truce to the governor, who sent wine and food and loaned them boats to return to their ships. A couple of days later, Nelson wrote to the governor, thanking him for the way the wounded and trapped had been treated, and sent a barrel of beer and some English cheese. Early in 1798, Admiral St. Vincent sent 10 ships, each of 74 guns, to Nelson to chase down Napoleon. For those in the Navy, that you will recognize some of these names. There was Troubridge in the Culloden, Foley in the Goliath, Louis in the Minotaur, Peyton in the Defense, Darby in the Bellerophon, Westcott in the Majestic, Samuel Hood in the Zealous, Hallowell in the Swiftsure, Miller in the Theseus, and Gould in the Audacious. The smaller Leander under Thomas Thompson also joined Nelson. These were professionals and they were friends. And it was at this time, 1798, that Napoleon arrived and took Malta. His attack was scarcely opposed. The island, in which both Naples and Russia had interests or designs, was held by the Knights of St. John. They had a German Grand Master and were in the last stages of disunity and decay, surrounded by rebellious Maltese. The French knights refused to fight their countrymen, and the Grand Master surrendered to Bonaparte after nothing more than a token defense. In a few days, Bonaparte had abolished the order, drafted new regulations for the island, rearranged the curriculum of the university, loaded the holds of Lorient with the knight's treasure, installed a garrison, and sailed for Egypt, closely crossing the path of Nelson without either of them knowing. Nelson spent several weeks looking for the French fleet, eventually finding them in Egypt at the entrance to the Nile. The battle that ensued brought about as thorough a rout as one could imagine, and showed what his band of brothers, his team of captains, could achieve. Every time the weather allowed, they had gathered with Nelson on board his ship, the Vanguard, spoken together, discussed scenarios and tactics until they knew and understood each other intimately. Nelson was injured again at the Nile when a piece of shrapnel lifted a 3-inch wedge of skin on his forehead above his blind eye. He thought he would not survive and insisted that the surgeon attend to others, but eventually he was persuaded he would pull through and allowed treatment. A few months later, Nelson came to Malta, saw that the Maltese were fighting well alongside the Neapolitans, took back Gozo, but left the British siege of Valletta, which was still in the hands of the French and who held out until well into the next year. His next encounter was the Battle of Copenhagen, where, true to form, he disobeyed an order and led his ships to an expensive but decisive victory. His commander, Admiral Sir Hyde Parker, was anchored outside, close enough to hear the ferocity of the battle, but far enough to not know the details of progress. He was so concerned that he decided to make the signal of recall. As he said, for Nelson's sake, because if he is in a condition to continue the action successfully, he will disregard the order. If he is not, it will be an excuse for his retreat, and no blame can be imputed on him. This was the signal that Nelson famously ignored by putting his glass to his blind eye and remarking, "I really do not see the signal." The following day, the victorious Nelson was sent ashore to negotiate with the Prince of Denmark, and although exhausted, returned with an armistice and Denmark turning away from both their allies, Sweden and Russia. And so on to Trafalgar. Nelson had been chasing the French and Spanish fleets since January of 1805, playing cat and mouse around the Mediterranean and all the way to the West Indies and back. He had retired to England to rest, the first he had had in 3 years, when news of the French fleet being in Cadiz came to him. And he immediately set sail, having discussed his strategy for engaging the French with several people whom he respected, a development of what he had worked at the Nile. He arrived outside Cadiz on the eve of his 47th birthday, and over the next weeks, once again, he engaged his captains, discussing tactics and what-ifs. His final tactical memorandum included the sentence, "Captains are to look to their particular line as their rallying point. But in case signals cannot be seen or clearly understood, no captain can do very wrong if he places his ship alongside that of an enemy." Nelson described his strategy as the Nelson touch, and it was received with unanimous approval. It was new, it was singular, it was simple. The French admiral, Villeneuve, who had escaped Nelson at the Nile, had taken refuge in Cadiz and had also incurred the wrath of Napoleon, who had been intent on massing his forces in Boulogne to cross the Channel and invade Great Britain. Bonaparte sent another officer to take over the fleet, and on hearing this, Villeneuve, rather than succumb to the ignominy, set sail with 18 French and 15 Spanish ships of the line. He remembered Nelson's tactics at the Nile and had briefed his officers that Nelson might well try something similar this time. It is of note that as his fleet lined up in 2 columns, as he had designed, Nelson walked amongst the crew of the Victory, a crew that included Americans, French, Spaniards, Germans, Dutch, and Swiss. His officers tried to persuade him to allow at least the Temeraire to go ahead and lead the attack, but Nelson declined. Shortly after, at 11:30, battle was joined, but because of the disposition of the guns and his approach, there was a 15-minute gap between the Victory being under fire before she was able to return it. In that time, 20 of the crew had been killed and another 30 injured. I won't go into the detail of the battle, except to say that this was warfare the like of which it is hard to imagine today. The ships came so close to each other that when the British guns were run out, their muzzles came into contact with the Redoutable's side, and consequently at every discharge there was reason to fear that the enemy would catch fire, and both the Victory and the Temeraire on the other side might be engulfed in her flames. Here then was seen the astonishing spectacle of the fireman of each gun standing ready with a bucket full of water, which as soon as the gun was discharged, he dashed into the enemy ship through the holes made in her side by the shot and doused the flames. This close quarter battle was the province of the musketeers, and it was one of their number from the Redoutable who shot Nelson, wearing his uniform with full regalia, and it took him down 90 minutes after battle had been joined. The musket ball went through his left shoulder and severed his spine. Nelson knew he was done for, but retained his presence of mind to put a handkerchief over his face as he was taken below, in order that he might not be recognized and so morale might be affected. He kept trying to decline aid because he knew his spine was broken, but was nevertheless clear in his description to the surgeon of his sensations of his wound. He also had the presence of mind to ensure that Hardy, the Victory's captain, anchored as soon as possible after the battle was won. Nelson died at 4:30 and had directed little of the battle once the ships had engaged, but it was still his victory. He had briefed and shared his ideas and orders so clearly with all his officers, they understood and had the confidence in each other to know precisely what to do. The British seamen were also far more disciplined and extremely well practiced. It was a French naval officer who commented afterwards, "The act that astonished me the most was when the action was over. It came on to blow a gale, and the English immediately set to work to shorten sail and reef the topsail with as much regularity and order as if the ships had not been fighting a dreadful battle. We were all amazement, wondering what the English seamen could be made of. All our seamen were either drunk or disabled, and we, the officers, could not get any work out of them. We had never witnessed such clever maneuvers before, and I shall never forget them." The result of the Battle of Trafalgar secured the primacy of the British Royal Navy for the next 100 years. So what of this, our hero? He was a man of and for the people, a superb tactician and sailor, fiercely patriotic, driven by a thrill for battle, a craving for acknowledgement, and with scarce concern for his own mortality. Nelson knew that morale was of the highest importance, and so combined the practice of keeping his men occupied, thus preventing boredom, and the principle that it was far easier to keep men healthy than for a physician to cure them. He himself suffered, apparently with little complaint, from his wounds, with persistent pain and increasing blindness, with even his good eye beginning to fail. In a eulogy, Lord Malmesbury later said, "He added to genius, valor, and energy the singular power of electrifying all within his atmosphere." On that inspiring thought, on the 217th anniversary of his final battle, I invite you all, gentlemen, to raise your glasses and drink a toast to the immortal memory.